to episode 469 of Retro Encounter, RPG fans' bi-weekly podcast of many topics. I am your host today, Zach Wilkerson, and we are here to, it's sort of a sequel to our conversation over the last couple of weeks. We are here today to talk about Yoko Taro, or Taro Yoko, depending on how you want to say it. And we're going to be kind of continuing what we call our Auteur Encounter series, which is an idea originally that started with Yoko Taro by one of our panelists, which, speaking of, let me introduce our panelists, starting with the person whose idea this was, Aleks Franiczek.
Hello, hello.
Hello. And also joining us is Ben Love.
Hi.
And finally, last but not least, Pat Gann.
What's up, party people?
Hello. Thank the three of you so much for joining me to talk about this. Talk about Yoko Taro and all the wild stuff that he does. All the we'll talk some about his stage plays, his anime, obviously his games,
Including the mobile ones, I guess.
I guess. I won't be talking about that because I haven't really played the mobile games. But before we get into that, I want to kind of explain what this episode's even going to be like. So we did an episode, it was like 8 months ago, called the Hironobu Sakaguchi Auteur Encounter, basically, where we were looking at sort of his design philosophy and how it moved and how it sort of progressed over the course of, his life of making games. We kind of looked at those individual games. And if you don't know what the word auteur means, it's kind of from film. Basically, it's this theory that the director has sort of the predominant voice. It was originally sort of invented by French people, but then popularized in America by a guy named Andrew Sarris. It was very controversial even when he first came out with it. It's still controversial now. And even in this conversation today, I think it's somewhat controversial to say that like Yoko Taro is like the primary creator on any of these things, because especially in games, you have so many people who work with stuff. And so it's going to be part of our conversation is how much is his sort of authorial voice coming through in these games? How much is it not? How does it develop? Things like that. So, but before we get into that, I do want to kind of give the audience a little bit of a background on how much Taro we know and sort of our history with Taro. Because I think that with everyone here, we've covered every game he's made, but I don't think anyone here has played everything. So we're going to be kind of bouncing between who talks more at different times. So we'll start with you, Ben. What's sort of your history with Taro? How'd you get into him? How many of his games have you played? Just what's your history with Taro?
Yeah, so I think the first game of Taro's that I played was Nier, originally on the PS3, and then I went back and played Dragon Guard 1 and 2, and then 3 when that came out, and then Nier Automata, obviously. And I've also played Voice of Cards, but just the first one. So mostly the console games, and I haven't really touched any of the mobile stuff.
Awesome. And what about you, Aleks?
Yeah, so he first came onto my radar when the original Nier came out, because despite all the criticisms I heard of that game, it wasn't super well received critically when it first came out. I just heard like tons of praise for the storytelling, how unique it was, and how it had like one of the best soundtracks in any RPG, which is always something that attracts me to an RPG. But I never got around to actually getting my hands on it. But when Nier Automata came out and it got just tons of critical praise, arguably his first game to have tons of critical praise, I ended up buying it pretty immediately, even before I had a PS4. I was living with a roommate who had a PS4, so I bought that game just to be able to finally experience what was up with his work. Absolutely loved it, and then have just kind of been working my way backwards since. Ended up playing the original Nier finally on an Xbox, which removes a lot of the, like on a newer Xbox through backwards compatibility, removing a lot of those performance issues that the original game had. I think it plays great. If people are still interested in experiencing the original one, and played Dragon Guard. Obviously, we just discussed that. And also the Voice of Cards trilogy. I've dabbled in it. I actually didn't get around to playing the first one, but I did play the second and third. and I also dabbled in the mobile games, but didn't get to finish either because my patience for the mobile mechanics were just kind of running out at some point with both those titles. So yeah, experienced most of his stuff.
Awesome. It's funny that you said that the original Nier didn't get a great critical reception upon release, because I know someone here who did give it a very nice review on release, and he was right. And his name is Pat. So Pat, talk to us about your history with Taro.
Sure. So I played Drakengard when it came out. You know, Yoko Taro wasn't a well-known name at the time, but I enjoyed it. When I went to E3 2009, I saw a demo of Nier. Yoko Taro wasn't there. The producer Yosuke Saito was. He's the one who did the presentation. I wasn't impressed with it at the time. It didn't have any music at the time, so I think that was part of the problem.
Hard to imagine Nier without the music,
Yeah,
especially for
yeah.
you.
Yes, exactly. So when I played it in April 2010, I consider it kind of life-changing. I do think it is, uh, one of the most interesting stories ever made, and I liked all the genre swapping in terms of gameplay
Mhm.
style throughout. And then I've played mostly everything. I have not played the third Voice of Cards. I just finished the second one last night, so I'm a little behind. Yeah, I haven't played any of the Final Fantasy 14 near content. Oh, and I haven't played the Replicant remake, though I am very familiar with what happens with the additional ending E scenario. So yeah, I'm pretty obsessed, is what I'm trying to say.
I think we all might fall into that category. Maybe you more than most. Yeah. So my history is sort of similar to Alex's. I I hadn't really, because I was kind of not. It was sort of in a space in my life. I was early in my teaching career when the first Nier came out, and if anyone's ever been a teacher before knows that, like, early, you don't really have time to think about anything but just that. But when Automata came out, interestingly, I didn't own a PS4, but I read RPG Fan, and I read a review by a woman named Alana Higgs, and I was like, oh my goodness, that sounds like exactly the kind of game that I want to play. And it convinced me finally to get a PS4 along with like Persona 5 and some other stuff. And then I played Automata, and I was like, oh my god, this game is incredible. But I wouldn't have necessarily called it one of my absolute favorite games the first time through. After I got hired with RPG Fan, I then played through the Game of the Yorha edition, which just adds a couple of DLCs that are kind of silly. But that second time through, I was like, oh, this game's even better than I thought. And then I played it a third time for Retro, and I was like, oh, this is, I think, my favorite game. And it would probably be like, depending on the day, there's like 3 games that kind of switch back and forth for what my favorite game is. But I still hadn't played anything else from Taro. I go back and I play the original Nier. I think it's just incredible. And then I play Replicant, the remake, which I think is even better than the original. Still not on
No.
Automata's level, but it's great. But it's funny because for so long I had been trying to get Solosi to put Drakengard on the podcast, and it was never going to happen unless I just forced it. And I when I took over, I just forced it, and so I hadn't played a lot of other Taro stuff because of that. So in the last like probably 2 months, I have like shotgun Taro, like to like an unhealthy degree that I think I'm going a little insane. I played Drakengard. I played Drakengard 3. I played the first 2.5 Voice of Cards games. I was going to play all 3, but then Silk Song came out and it kind of blew that whole thing up. Um, I've never played the mobile games because I think I tried Reincarnation briefly and Shino or Sino Alice, and I was just like, I just can't get into playing games on my phone. But I've also watched some stage plays, I've watched some animes, I've read a number of the short stories that Taro himself wrote. So I also might be obsessed. I'm glad that a lot of you talked about playing Drakengard when it first came out, because Taro wasn't a name yet, and it's so funny now that he is sort of one of, I think, the preeminent sort of voices in the game space, at least for people who are really interested sort of in game design and in pushing game design. But just like with Sakaguchi, he doesn't start as this like big
Mhm.
auteur. Before he works on Drakengard, he works on a variety of games. but not as a director, and not even in like any sort of a major role. Drakengard ends up being like a huge promotion, it seems like.
Hmm.
Time Crisis 2, Phase Paradox. I don't know a ton about the work he did on these games,
Yeah.
but Ben, I think you do.
Yeah, so he got his start at Namco in the mid '90s. I guess like right after he graduated from college, and he was originally like a CGI artist on some Namco games. So the only one I can find like direct credits for is Time Crisis 2. There's like some suggestion he might have also worked on Alpine Racer 2, which is like an arcade skiing game that Namco made back then. But so basically, just like kind of grunt level CGI work on some Namco titles. And I think in some interviews, he's mentioned like hating doing that and like that he wasn't very happy with his work like as a visual artist. But I think what's important about, especially those early years at Namco, is that that's where he would have met Takuya Iwasaki, who would later go on to leave Namco and form Kavia. And so that's kind of where that connection is and why he ended up at Kavia and then also ended up directing Drakengard, is that he met a lot of the people who would go on to form Kavia at Namco. And then after working at Namco, he moved to a developer that was under the Sony umbrella called Sugar and Rockets. And he worked on Phase Paradox there. And Phase Paradox is a really interesting game. It's like a sci-fi survival horror adventure kind of game, and he worked primarily on like
I feel like you just
cutscenes.
described like your kind of game, Ben.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, absolutely. It kind of hits all the bases. Unfortunately, it's not ever been like fan translated, so it's a little difficult to play. He worked on like cutscene direction for that, so I think that's maybe where he kind of developed the chops that would then allow him to direct Drakengard, is doing that kind of cutscene direction on Phase Paradox. Um, but yeah, it's a really interesting game. That one in particular, it does have English voice acting, so if you can watch like a long play of it and kind of get the story, there's also like a YouTuber called Eurothug 4000 who has a really good video on that game. So if anybody's interested in it,
Sorry,
watch
I'm
that.
laughing at Eurothug 4000.
Yeah,
Yeah.
username rules.
Yeah. But it's a really good video that kind of goes over the entire game. And that is, I think, where he kind of, got those directing, you know, credits or like experience that then would allow him to actually direct a full game. And there is some like suggesting he worked on some game design for that game too. But those are the major things before he went to Copia.
Yeah, I did see that as well, that even though he only got credited for like visual effects and opening sequence on Phase Paradox, that and this often happens in the game industry, and I think especially in the Japanese game industry, where you get credited for what you were hired to do, but because of the circumstances of game development, sometimes you end up doing other things with just how the process is going and what departments need more assistance. So there's a good, yeah, chance that he was doing some kind of like more game designy or narrative kind of input in Phase Paradox, which maybe got him like the attention that he needed from like higher ups, that ended up leading to him being like director of Drakengard, because otherwise that's such a huge step up in terms of
Hmm.
like responsibility. And I did watch some of like long play of Phase Paradox. It seems really interesting, and yeah,
Hmm.
because the voice acting is English, you can actually kind of understand what's happening.
Yeah, it's really, and what is really interesting too, because it's a sequel to a shooter, like a shoot 'em up
Mhm.
from the PS1 called Philosoma, which was like a genre kind of shifting shoot 'em up, and then the sequel is like a survival horror game. It's like it's totally crazy, but it kind of fits into his like genre bending that he would do in his later games. And I don't know, maybe he got some inspiration from working there at Sony and that team too.
Does the storytelling, just out of curiosity, does the storytelling seem to kind of do some of the inversions that he would be known for later, or is it just like dark? Or I'm not sure how much you guys know. I'm just curious.
I mean, it's more like a dark sci-fi story, but it is like it has a lot of those adventure game elements that would kind of show up in like some of his later work, like branching paths and things like that. So um I think that that is probably a little bit of inspiration there, or he kind of the kind of adventure game style crops up in his other work from time to time, and so I think maybe that's part of where he got an appreciation for that.
Yeah, and before obviously that's an important early project. The most important one is Drakengard, and before we get to that, I do want to mention to the listeners, like we're going to talk about a bunch of games here, and a lot of sort of side things. We're going to try not to spoil stuff directly. Of course, in order to talk about some of the themes, we might sort of like indirectly hit on some plot points or things like that. But like, I would never in a million years want to spoil the ending of Nier Automata for someone who hasn't played it, for example. So even if you haven't played any Taro games, at least I think you'll be okay listening. But we'll see how it goes. Because sometimes it's hard to talk about Taro without talking about sort of where it goes, because where it goes is usually the point. Um, sort of, or it's pointless, which we'll get there. But yeah, I mean, as you were talking about, he does all this work on other games, and then he comes into Drakengard, and I don't think he's originally slated to be director on Drakengard, but sort of through the development process, he becomes the director on Drakengard. And we've already talked a lot about Drakengard. I'm not going to try to say a lot about it from a thematic perspective necessarily, given that we just spent 2 full weeks talking about it. But I think that in some ways, and we spent a lot of time discussing like how you see sort of all these sort of game design elements sort of like fighting with each other, from like these different visions and versions, and Taro is not considered this genius that probably like the people are all like, yes, we will do what you say, Yoko. So I think it's interesting, but it establishes so much of what he eventually does. You get branching paths and endings, which becomes a staple of everything that he does afterwards. You get unfriendly game design, where the game actively seems to want you to not do what you're doing, but you do it anyway. Um, and in this case, I think, and we'll kind of talk about it going forward. In this case, like he doesn't want you to do it because it's like kind of unfun. Instead of like, I think later it eventually becomes like you have an emotional toll from continuing forward. Whereas I wasn't really emotionally invested in Drakengard. I was more like emotionally repulsed by Drakengard is a better way of putting it. So yeah, I think it's an interesting game, at least as a sort of a genesis of what he becomes later.
Yeah, and and like you were saying, Zach, like it's even though it's his first like directorial role, there is a lot of like I mean, video games are a collaborative process every time, obviously, but there's a lot more like cooks in the kitchen for Drakengard in particular. Like the core concept was developed before he was even on the project. So you have that kind of tension with a lot of different creatives having input into that game. And then I think the more kind of auteur style that Yoko Taro would develop kind of develops with the games after that, because he had more creative control, I think, of those than he did with Drakengard. Even though Drakengard is kind of establishing that, his style in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it really just starts showing you how like interested he is in kind of subverting what video games are through experimentations with genre, through recontextualizing like action that's normally presented as just like you're the hero and you're doing good and like all this killing doesn't matter. It's just fun because you're doing such a good thing. Drakengard just flips that to its most like intense extreme by making you like putting you in the shoes of just literally a murderous psychopath in Kaim. And I just think like that kind of directorial style of wanting to do something subversive and trying to make all the other elements of the game kind of support that. Like I think obviously of the OST in this game, which I think even though I wouldn't want to listen to it outside of the context of the game, I think it's one of the
You
most.
can now though, because now it's on a
Yeah,
Spotify.
thanks to our podcast, no doubt. Yeah, so I do think it's one of the most impressive OSTs I've seen in an RPG, just because it complements the action and adds so much to the overall aesthetic experience the game offers like so well. And ultimately, I think that's what Yoko Taro as a director wants to do. He wants to offer more aesthetic experiences that a lot of video games that stick too much to convention can't offer. So by literally putting in a soundtrack that like hurts your ears, he's trying to like make a statement. He's trying to like do something more, uh, yeah, just like screeching violins mixed into like insanity. Yeah, it's a crazy thing, but it really goes to show how much ambition this guy has. And I think Drakengard also starts introducing some of the key supporting cast that we see coming up in later games, because he works with a lot of the same people across his career, with people like kind of coming and going at the same time. But this establishes the beginning of his relationship with Sawako Notori, who's the
Hmm.
scenario writer on basically all of his projects up until Nier Automata. And I think Yoko Taro obviously has a hand in the story for all these games as well, but the main scenario writer, he's not credited as that. He usually has these other collaborators. So we see, yeah, him working with Sawako Notori and also Kimihiko Fujisaka, who's the character designer of the Drakengard trilogy, and also ends up coming back to do character design on Voice of Cards. So
Hmm.
I think what we're gonna do throughout this episode as well is just try to highlight these supporting characters, because when we think of a Yoko Taro game, it's not just Yoko Taro's creative direction; it's also what these people bring to the table as well, right?
I wanted to say something about the Drakengard soundtrack. Functionally, yes, it is grating and monotonous, but what the soundtrack actually is recordings of big, famous, primarily 1800s and 1900s classical scores, uh, torn up and sampled and put in loops, which is what Nobuyoshi Sano and Takayuki Ayahara were tasked to do with that game. And metaphorically, if you think about that, you can think about that as a clash and tearing apart and dissolution of civilization through its music. And when you put it in that context, I think it fits Drakengard quite well,
Oh,
because
it's
we are
brilliant. Yeah.
witnessing the world being torn apart, and it ain't gonna go well.
Yeah, I love every time the Drakengard credits roll, like, because obviously you see them multiple times if you're getting all the endings, and you start seeing like Mozart in the credits. It's pretty funny.
It's pretty incredible what they did, in my opinion, and it is not casual listening for sure. But if you know the source material, I think it's a very sort of cerebrally interesting thing to listen to.
I think one of the things that we haven't touched on too much is, Taro's. I think one of his absolute favorite games growing up. I think he actually cited it as his favorite game. And if you go on Twitter, you can see him like buying collector's editions from limited run of Gradius and
Hmm.
sort of the
Hmm.
shooters. And I think that while the dragon combat is certainly meant to be ace combat above all else, I think it's how the game was originally conceived.
Yeah.
It it's you can see that like Taro is not interested in just having one kind of gameplay here, and it as we've been discussing, it's sort of just like how it happened. I'm not sure that it was necessarily like Yoko Taro made this decision. In fact, I know Yoko Taro did not necessarily make this decision to make the game what it was from a gameplay perspective.
Yeah.
But you
Yeah.
get the impression though that he sort of works on that and works through that, and he's like, "Oh, I can do this. I can kind of make this work." And then you see that, sort of come to fruition in, Near, and then especially in Automata, where you get these really different types of gameplay. And for all my criticisms of the gameplay, I do think from a conceptual perspective, it's really interesting in Direct Guard.
Yeah, it's also very interesting that Yoko Taro is like considered this like kind of RPG like designer auteur, because I think in like you're saying, Zach, it's just kind of like a genre that he kind of fell into, and he adds all of these elements of other game genres into his games. And I think it's one of those things where it seems like the reason that like the games are fundamentally still like RPGs is just that that is like maybe the best vector in terms of game design for like stories and writing
Mm.
and storytelling. But that he's not really particularly tied to that style of game, to RPG like game design, other than just that's like the best vehicle for the storytelling for the most part. And he's like really interested in doing all these other kind of game design concepts. And I think that you don't that's not something that you get with necessarily a lot of other direct like RPG like long time RPG directors.
Yeah, and I think the reason that he probably was always returning to the RPG rather than like adventure games, which is obviously like the other big genre for storytelling, is that like he's always interested in making commentaries on like violence, both as like a meta statement and as like just like a in context like storytelling device. Just like why do people commit like acts of violence? Like he's very interested in exploring the human condition through these ideas like hatred and violence and how people like channel their emotions, and that ends up being kind of what informs a lot of his gameplay expression, I feel.
He pushes you so far away from who these individuals are that like it becomes like very clear that's what this game is for. And I do think that as he matures as a storyteller and as a game designer, he's able to do it in a more interesting way. Even in Drakengard 3, which we'll get to, like I still had an emotional connection to many of the characters, no matter how ridiculous they were, in this really violent sort of space. But there is something sort of very particular about that there. But I think that it serves as a baseline for him to build on as he goes forward. But interestingly, he does not build on it in the next game in Drakengard because he's not really in charge of it. In one of the things that's interesting about Taro, and I think we talked about this pre-recording, is that it's really hard to kind of get your hands on sort of what is true, what happened, even more than it might be in the Japanese game design sphere, because Yoko Taro just lies a lot. He tells all kinds of crazy stories. My wife did an interview with him, and like he didn't answer like any of her questions like in a way that was in any way thematically thoughtful. He was just goofing the whole time. And I remember when she first got them back, she was like kind of annoyed, and I was like, "Dude, that's just you just got Taro, dude. Like, congratulations." But Drakengard 2, I know that he did some visual work on it, but Drakengard 2 also, from a general design perspective, was meant to sort of go away from some of the darker elements of Drakengard 1. But I have not, full disclosure, done anything but watched about 10 minutes of Drakengard 2. So could someone else talk to me about sort of his involvement, but also how you can see his voice being absent and maybe sort of being there as well?
Yeah, so he was involved in like the especially like the beginning like creative direction of the game, but a lot of his so he wasn't director, and so a lot of his like ideas or concepts for the game were kind of rejected by the rest of the team, and it's said that he and the director like butted heads a bit, and so I think that that's part of why his he doesn't have like a higher level like creative credit on the game is because of that kind of like tension that existed during development. But a lot of the rest of the team are people who worked on Dragon Guard 1, and as Alex was mentioning, Sawaku Natori was still the main writer for Dragon Guard 2, just like Dragon Guard 1. And so he like what he's credited on is mostly just like cutscene, like video editing, cutscene direction and editing. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting Dragon Guard and 2 in particular is an interesting game because it's like a creative team trying to like deal with the like ramifications of the storytelling from the first game, and like how do you follow that up with like a direct sequel. And I think it's interesting to see like especially in Atori, how where would you go from here, like how do you build on Drakengard 1 with a direct sequel. And I think it is a really interesting answer, even if Yoko Taro wasn't as involved in the creative direction with the game.
Yeah, I feel like Drakengard 2 is a really interesting study to talk about in this episode because it's like what does a game with the same kind of team look like if it's missing Yoko Taro as that creative lead? and I think the differences between Drakengard 2 and 1 really help us see where Yoko Taro's creativity like tends to gravitate towards. So I know with 2, the lead designer Akira Yasui, um, from Drakengard 1 ended up being the director, and
Hmm.
like you said, Ben, like they were like butting heads quite a bit, like to the extent that like I think their love-hate relationship was kind of reflected in the office, and their rivalry was even represented in a weapon story for the weapon King's Blood, which tells like
Yes.
of a battle between these two generals who were once friends but had like different approaches, so they like were ended up like getting into a war with each other, which is funny. But yeah, Dragon Guard 2 is interesting because I've been playing it, and I think like it's the on the ground sort of gameplay is a clear step up from Dragon Guard. I think there's just like more to kind of the comboing system. You just have like more mechanics to have fun with. The way companions are integrated is a little more traditional, but also makes more sense, I feel. Um, but at the same time, like the main protagonist here, Noe, is like a pretty typical goody two
Hmm.
shoes shonen kind of trope. And it just doesn't fit the gameplay style nearly as well as Kime, and led to like a lot of cases where I was just like feeling this sort of like narrative dissonance. Like there was a mission where the Knights of the Seal, who you start off like Noe is working with,
Hmm.
um, they're like doing like pretty bad things. They're like a major army that's kind of just oppressing and trying to keep order in the world in like an oppressive way. But like the slaves that they control in order to like kind of keep their own sort of influence over the world start rebelling, and then the mission is like you have to kill them, right? So this is like something that you would probably find in like a Drakengard mission, but then like a key element of Yoko Taro's games is the way like NPC dialogue works like throughout the mission to try to like add context to it. And here like we just have Noe like talking about like, oh, it's so horrible. I don't want to be doing this. But as a player, you're just like mowing these things away, and you're having fun doing it. And it's like, okay, well, this kind of unification of gameplay and storytelling that Drakengard 1 achieved, even if it like took it to such a intense extreme, it's just like completely like missing here.
Yeah, and I think too, Alex, like you're talking about, Sawaku Notori's approach to the storytelling in this game. I think the most like interesting aspect is that the game kind of focuses a lot and revolves a lot around mana from Drakengard 1,
Yeah.
and it's almost like her trying to kind of like redeem this character that was kind of an antagonist, but almost like more of like a vessel for like the evil corrupting force in Drakengard 1, and not really, that didn't really have a lot of her own agency. And so a lot of this game is like about Mana as a person and her trying to like make change the world and reflect, in response to like what had been done in her name, or what she had done in the previous game. And that's like a really interesting concept. I don't know if it's something, I think it's something that like Yoko Taro probably wouldn't do. Like, how do we redeem this like kind of evil character from the previous game? But as a reaction to kind of like his storytelling choices, I think it makes the game really really interesting. And I definitely think if you played Drakengard 1 and enjoyed it, Drakengard 2 is a really really interesting companion piece to it in that way.
What if I
Um,
played Drakengard 1 and didn't enjoy
yeah.
Maybe keep away
Yeah.
then.
I kind of liked for Drakengard 2 some of the stuff they did with like, can someone remind me the name of these things? Giant headed baby angels.
Oh, the like the Watchers, or the,
Yeah.
yeah, the grotesque, or I think they're like grotesqueries or something. I forget what the exact term is, but they're like the things the Watchers like produce or whatever, right? Yeah.
They were one of my favorite things about the end of the first Guard, and like all the stuff with um who's that optional character, Ariosh.
Or, yeah,
uh
Ariosh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's some crazy stuff there for those who have played the game. And I was like, there's no way they're ever coming back. And that was one of the few things, like the last few chapters of Drakengard 2, they actually become like a significant
Hmm.
part of the story. And if there's one thing I'd like to see more of in future games, it's them. And to that point, I will add, like, I don't think Drakengard 2 is like erased in Yoko Taro's mind from like the Taro verse, so to speak. But when you think about like how characters from past games get referenced or pulled into future games, like the one game that gets the least love and the least representation is almost certainly Drakengard 2. Um, it's kind of like an offshoot, and I think that might have to do with Yoko Taro's reduced role in the game.
I mean, it's the same thing we see with like Dark Souls 2. It's like just because Miyazaki wasn't the director on it, it's like people just like I feel are a lot more like people grow attached to these auteur figures that are presented to us, and once they're taken away, it's like people start to see like where it like doesn't live up to like the
I mean,
standards that they're
have you
familiar with
seen the
anymore.
runbacks in Dark Souls 2?
I actually
Oh.
like Dark Souls 2, and
Yeah, me
and
too.
and I appreciate. I think that's a good comparison, Alex. It's a very, yeah. There's almost a 1-to-1 there if you think about the Drakengard trilogy and the Dark Souls trilogy. Like the reason why 2 kind of gets flack, I think part of it is like you said, like, oh, like the key guy that we want to be there isn't there, and it definitely has an influence on how things play out differently.
Yeah, but I mean, I do think if you are interested in Yoko Taro's like work, then it is worth playing Drakengard 2. Like, I definitely don't think it's one to be ignored because it is just really interesting to see the team kind of have to react to his like creative and narrative decisions with like a direct follow up, which you don't really get with any of his other games. And I think that's kind of why, right? Like I feel like he kind of like he establishes a concept and then maybe, he'll loosely tie the next game to something in the previous game, but it's
Mhm.
it's kind of its own thing. And this is just like a really interesting case where they did like a direct narrative
Mm.
follow up with like a lot of the same characters and the same world and everything. And it's just interesting to see that because it's not something that you really get with his other work as much.
I mean, speaking of, I mean, the next game he actually is the director on. I'm not really sure what he did, and someone can fill this in if they know what he did in between sort of Drakengard 1 and a little bit on 2, and then all the way 5 years later to Near, which originally I think is sort of pitched as Drakengard 3, as the third Drakengard game, and
Yeah.
to some degree, I think actually Taro himself believes that it is sort of Drakengard 3 in his mind.
Mhm.
But as Ben was alluding to, near just not to spoil anything about the original Drakengard, but there's something absolutely wild happens in ending E. That's just like originally was kind of as like a joke ending, but then it ends up being the impetus for the entire story of Near. But you don't need to have any of that knowledge. There are some vague references to it in some of the text adventures, which we'll talk about, but like the same way that I played Automata without playing the original Nier first, and I still enjoyed it. I played the Nier without playing Drakengard, and it it didn't actually add anything to my enjoyment of Nier by playing Drakengard. But also speaking of music directors, this is where Okabe and Monica start come in. But for me, this is where Taro reaches maturity as a game designer and a director. And there are some things that are janky about this game, but I can and I will defend them as being excellent because I really love Nier. But I know I'm going to talk a lot about Nier, so I want other people to go first before I start just yammering on here.
Yeah, Zach, I think you mentioned like there's such a big gap between Drakengard 2 and then Nier, and I really think that's just due to kind of what was hitting the Japanese game industry at the time, which is the transition to HD. And Kavia in particular, I think, had a lot of trouble with that. I think that kind of is borne out in some of the, jankier elements of this game. I think compared to a lot of games like RPGs that had like a difficult transition to HD. This game actually kind of came out pretty exemplary. It's kind of to, I think, Taro's credit and the team at Kavia that they ended up with something so interesting despite having so much development trouble.
Yeah, I think we have to give a lot of credit here also to Yosuke Saito, who was
Yeah.
one of the co-founders of Kavia, and also he's like got a producer or exec producer credit on like all of Yoko's games, I'm pretty sure. And apparently it was him that, like, despite the, I guess, kind of lackluster response to Drakengard, like he really believed in Yoko Taro and his vision for video games. So it was him that like kind of pushed for Yoko to get like another chance in a directorial role.
Hmm.
But he also wanted Nier to be more of just like a straight action game. Like they wanted to have like kind of commercial incentive here and to kind of profit off of the success of games like God of War, which you could see really clearly in Nier, like the OG Nier, and also in Dad Nier for sure in
Yeah.
particular.
Yeah, I mean that's like the whole genesis of like the Gestalt and Replicant like kind of split, right? Is like this idea that we're going to make two versions of the game, and we're making one version to appeal to the West and we're making another version to appeal to Japan, which is kind of just a crazy kind of concept in general that they did that. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like Nier Gestalt actually ended up being an unintentional pioneer of dad games. Like I feel like the dad game wasn't in full force yet until like 2013 with like Last of Us and Walking Dead and BioShock Infinite, but Nier Gestalt like
Then
preceded
interestingly,
all
God
of
of War
those.
becomes Sad Dad game
Yeah.
too. So
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And
Yeah.
maybe this isn't, I don't know how popular of a take this is, but I actually prefer having Dad Nier as the protagonist over Brother Nier.
Mhm.
Same.
I
Yeah, I
just
agree with you.
Same.
Yeah.
I just like the fact that like it's like a pretty like young cast with like Emil and Kaine and everything, and the king of the desert city. And I feel like having like an older guy like be kind of like I like the character dynamics better of having like this older guy be like kind of their friend. I think it's more interesting and unique.
I really like the voice acting in like the English original Nier, which again we got the Gestalt old dude version. I really like. I think he did a good job. I don't know who it is, but I really like the voice acting of Daddy Nier. I think he brings an interesting shift to the dynamic of what otherwise really feels sort of like a sort of teen anime in a not very anime kind of world. I dig his vibe. I also wanted to say, who was it that mentioned Yosuke Saito was sort of like a champion for Yoko Taro to get like his vision into another game? Um,
Yeah, I mentioned that.
yeah, I think that's super important for us to think about in terms of timeline. Like, there's we think about alternate timelines all the time with this series, right? Because near comes to be thanks to Drakengard's ending E, which is a one possible timeline. uh I imagine there's a timeline where no one comes around and champions Yoko Taro, and maybe he doesn't make games anymore, and then we don't have any of this. So Yosuke Saito definitely deserves some high fives for seeing like here's this creative juggernaut, and we don't want to miss out on what's playing around in his crazy brain.
Yeah, and just for like context for around Saito and just how much influence he had like in Square and like in the RPG sphere, like he was also like ended up being producer on all the Star Ocean and Valkyrie profile games from like the PS2 era onwards. He was also producer on Dragon Quest 11, and yeah, also on Babylon's Fall, but we don't need to talk about that one. But yeah, like this guy's clearly had like a really prominent career as an executive. So to have someone like that on the top level, like who sees like the talent of a creative and is able to make sure they still have a foothold in the industry, like that's huge. Like that's so important.
Yeah, I also want to mention too Takamasa Shiba, who was also producer on like the Drakengard games. He is was also producer on a lot of those Tri-Ace games, along with Saito. And he also played a big role in championing like getting these games made with Kavia, and in particular Drakengard 3. He was very involved in getting that project greenlit. So and he had a lot of influence, especially on the first Drakengard. I think he was actually the one who put forth the idea to have the ground combat when it was originally like an aerial combat game.
Mhm.
So he's another champion of Taro's work, and helped kind of get some of these games along. And I think Yoko Taro has even said that like there probably wouldn't have been a Drakengard 3 without Shiba as well.
Yeah, it's also funny to think of the idea that like going into this, apparently Yoko just wanted to make a normal game for once. I got a quote from him here. He said, "I thought with Nier that I would make a normal game. That's what I tried to make, a normal game." But then apparently he got bored and just like started making it weird. And apparently it was also like very much a response to 9/11 and the war on terror, and this whole idea of people being convinced that they're in the right, and that's like all they need to be able to like kill and feel justified in doing so. And we could see how that plays out through Nier's story.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that makes that messaging stronger, because to some degree Drakengard is doing something similar to that, right? But here, you as the player are deeply invested in these characters. We
Hmm.
haven't even said the name Kaine yet, which is embarrassing for all of you who were talking,
I
because
did. I
Kaine's so
said
good.
Kaine and Emil. I did.
Okay, you're right. Never mind. You can tell how much I love Kaine. Who is, like my favorite character in video games, and Emil, who is just like precious
Hmm.
and perfect and the ultimate weapon. And whether it's Dad Near, which you guys prefer, or I'll say more about this as Replicant later, the remake version of it, I prefer, because I think his relationship to his sister, and then also like he's so innocent to start, whereas the dad and Gestalt is like sort of grizzled, and you can sort of see him just sort of being like, well, this is for my daughter, whereas like Boy Near's like, oh, I'm such a nice boy who likes to help my sister. Now I will go murder, murder, murder. Um, and for me, that hits a little bit harder. But I guess my overall point is that because I am so invested in the characters, and I think even way more than Automata, which I think is a better game, because I love the characters here so much, I understand exactly why they're doing what they're doing. And Taro will then also kind of hit back harder, and you see the other side a lot more clearly. I remember there's like these robots that you have to kill. I won't say any names, but the first time you do it, the first time through, you don't hear their voices, you don't know who they are. Then the second time through, you get these cutscenes about the relationship between these two robots, and it's like really beautiful. But then you go cut them down anyway, man.
Bruh,
And
makes me tear up every playthrough.
yeah, I mean, I just think that the emotional side of it makes the messaging so much stronger. I think that while there is tedium in this game for sure for continuing on, like almost every side quest in this game is extremely boring to do, extremely annoying, but it's not so much that like I don't have anything to latch onto. And I'm not saying I'm the sort of person who needs to latch onto something, but I think it makes the messaging hit harder. And I guess maybe, as logical as I sort of like to think of myself, which I think Drakengard is sort of almost like an exercise in the illogic of what we usually don't think about. Here, with that emotion behind it, it really hits harder for me.
Yeah, and maybe part of that is even like at this point in terms of kind of um, Yokotaro's consistent staff. We have Hana Kikuchi introduced as a second scenario writer, so working alongside Natori. And the reason I bring that up is I feel like from this point onwards, in comparison to just like Drakengard 1, um, there's just more generally like empathy and kind of this melancholic tone in a lot of the writing, and I wonder if that could be attributed to Kikuchi's contributions, um, because that really ends up kind of being the main tone of Yoko Taro's work going forward. Is like there's like all this kind of like silly humor paired with like this melancholy, and that really first comes to a head here in OG Near. And I think it knocks it out of the park with it. Also, like starting to like have humor that um it's kind of a meta statement disparaging like boring game design, like whenever Grimoire Vice would like chime in when you're doing a boring side quest and essentially make fun of the design of the side quest, that ends up being a recurring theme in Yoko Taro's works going forward. That's sort of meta commentary. So
Yeah, there's an interview that just came out with Yoko Taro on the YouTube channel Archipel, where he kind of talks about his game design process, and he gives this really interesting metaphor where he says that creating a game is like shaping a cube made out of clay. And as you shape the cube and you change, you're shaping it into that form, and then you notice that one side is kind of like lopsided, so you go and you try to fix that side, but every time you do that, then another side is changes, right, because of the amorphous nature of the clay. And so that working on a game is constantly like shifting and changing and trying to shape it the way you want, but every time you do that, then something else changes and you have to go back and fix that. And then he says, and then you hit the deadline, and then the cube is done regardless of whether you've finished it or not. And he says that you look at the cube then and you feel like, oh well, it's actually pretty good. And then you come back a few years later and look at it, and then you notice the imperfections again, and so then you have the opportunity to then change those with the next project. And I thought that was such an interesting metaphor, that kind of explains maybe his this kind of design philosophy where he returns to the same ideas and the same core themes, but then offers like a different take on them. And kind of like what you, Alex, and Zach are saying about the themes, like you have similar themes in Drakengard that you do to Nier, but with Nier, he kind of like you can see where he's like, well, let's have more of a buy-in and emotional connection to the characters. And then even with Automata, you kind of see him evolving that as well. And I just think that was such an interesting idea for like how to approach game design. That really kind of shows up in his work and his returning to the same well over and over again.
Oh no, I agree, and I also think that can kind of extend to the game design in general. From like, I think that one of the really interesting things about Nier that's underrated about it is the different styles of gameplay, like sort of the side-scrolling parts that you have,
Hmm.
where it's not just sort of that straight hack and slash, but it all feels like really naturally integrated into. And again, like the gameplay is a little bit stiff, especially in the Gestalt version. It's a little bit boring at times, but certainly not as boring as it is in Drakengard. But even like I keep talking ahead to Automata here, but like at Automata, like the different gameplay stuff is like very clearly like a different thing. Whereas here, he manages to kind of weave it all in here in a way that feels as smooth as the original Drakengard, but it also has the advantage of not being so aggressively unfun that I want to put my head through the monitor. So, yeah,
Yeah, if I may, first of
of
all,
course.
good call on the Archipel interview video, which I think is also a setup for that Words/Worlds of Yoko Taro book,
Yes.
that
Yeah.
project that's being worked on. And I love that the title is Words and then the L in uh brackets, kind of like the ending titles and episode titles for Near Automata and the Automata anime. I thought that was really cute and clever and very Yoko Taro in nature. And yeah, the cube thing. One other thing he says is if there was no one who said here's a deadline, and if he never died, he imagines he could work on the same one cube forever and just be entertained by the process and never be done.
Yeah.
Which that also sounds about right. And then I also wanted to say, Zach, you were talking about the 2D platforming. One of the things I always think about is I played Mario Odyssey for the first time like a year ago. And you know those parts? Have you guys played Mario Odyssey?
Mhm.
oh yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, so you know those parts where it's like you shift to 2D, like, and you'll even like look old school, but the 2D happens like in the walls of a space, and then you'll jump out of that wall and be 3D again.
Mm.
Like that makes me think specifically of this one 2D platforming section that's part of a boss fight in the first Nier, and you're like running through this space like along the edges of walls, and then when you can pop out of it, you're back into like 3D mode to fight. And I'm like, the first time I played Mario Odyssey, I was like, did they take that from Nier? Like, I don't know of a game before Nier that would do that. We're playing a 3D game, but we're gonna force 2D along what's essentially a long wall and a wall with curvature. Um, I don't. I mean, I maybe someone did it before, but that's the first instance I know of.
Yeah, you might
Which,
be onto something there.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think it just goes to show like that he's not constrained by like genre or convention at all when it comes to like game design, and that he's just so willing to like break with like the preconceived notions of like what a role playing game should be or like an action game or whatever, right? That he's just willing to like do these kind of broad genre shifts if he feels like it fits the thematic, you know, kind of purpose of the game. Which I think it just makes his work stand out. Like you're saying, Pat. Like there's so many ideas that like you look and you play his games and you're like, oh, like this is an idea that like you see in like later work, and it always makes you wonder like did they did it come from here, and like is he really the first one to do it? And even though a lot of those ideas are like things that have shown up in other games maybe earlier, like the combination of them all together, I think is what makes it so unique and interesting.
Yeah, and
yeah,
I love how he plays with perspective both in like combat and just like storytelling situations. Like I love at the beginning of Nier when you're just in the house with Yona and it's got that it's like got that side scrolling perspective and it makes like the house just feel like this diorama. It just adds so much
Mm,
character to it that um it is just like a decision with camera work essentially that
yeah.
other people just wouldn't try. And then Zach, I think you're right that like there's nothing mechanically special about this game, but these experiments just trying to be creative with the way video games are presented to us, like it adds so much to the experience and makes it so much more memorable than a lot of other games, even though it's not like quote unquote like super fun of an experience.
yeah. It's experimental in its willingness to go everywhere, everywhere. I mean, there's like the one manor that plays like a hack and slash like Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance or almost like Diablo
Oh yeah,
because
the
it's like
Diablo.
the top
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah.
it's
Yeah.
like top down view and then you go to the forest and suddenly it's just a visual novel like white text black screen which that was one of my favorite parts of the whole game. And then most of the boss fights have like we talked about Gradius, it will have sort of like the
Bullet hell
Danmaku
kind
bullet
of.
hell
Yeah.
kind of
Hmm.
vibes, which definitely continues throughout most entries going forward. And I just like, no, it's not flawless. There's plenty to point out and say, oh, that wasn't fun or that was frustrating. Yeah, there is a reason why I scored it so high when I reviewed the game originally
Yeah.
in 2010, and it was because I had never played anything even close to as sort of um, off the wall and crazy as this, gameplay and also story. Like you beat the game and then it's like, all right, now you get to hear everything Kaine hears. And now we learn what shades are and what's really going like that. I mean, we talked about that earlier. Like we think we're just killing mindless, soulless, bad things. And that's one of his favorite things that he likes to play around with is uh the personhood and the value of the entity that you just think of as the foe, the thing to cut down, and
Mhm.
having to not necessarily humanize because not everyone is necessarily human, but sort of personalize and sort of count as an equal to you, and then you're like, oh my god, what am I doing?
That hits the nail on the head. Like I feel like one of the main themes of his games is perspective
Hmm.
and just trying to use the different playthrough approach that he does to peel back these additional layers of perspective that like will recontextualize events we already experienced. And I think by doing that he's just trying to like show like how limited an individual human's perspective actually is. And by doing that across these playthroughs in Nier, we start to see like both the virtuous side and sins of humanity kind of unfold at the same time. Like we see our characters as both virtuous and sinful, and I think that's such a like amazing trick to pull off. Like yeah, really something else.
Yeah, I think what you guys are both like hitting on and is kind of unique to his games is that, I mean, there was a lot of, especially in that time frame, like 2010, back when Nier came out, a talk about like ludonarrative dissonance, right? Which is the idea that like what you're doing in the gameplay and what the narrative is kind of portraying you as doing are like at odds with each other or in so much conflict. Like the popular example of that would be like Uncharted, right? Where Nathan Drake is like this affable guy, but he's killing like hundreds, if not thousands, of just like other people. And I think that Yoko Taro's games, like, they are so concerned with like kind of negating that, right? Like with actually exploring what and making you think about the other side of the player, right? Like the entities or the beings on the other side of the player, and like humanizing them, or recontextualizing, as you said, Alex, like making you think about those characters. And that is, I think, part of what gives his worlds and stories so much vibrancy and life, is that he really wants you to think about everything that is in the game world and all of the other characters or beings that populate it, and that all of those things are meaningful. They're not just obstacles for and in your way to progress the game. They are like truly meaningful part of the tapestry of the world that he's built in a way that a lot of other games just don't do. And I think that's maybe the most like unique and purposeful aspect of a lot of his work that kind of binds them all together.
Yeah, I mean, one way that I've always thought about it, and everything you guys have said is right on the money, of course. But one of the way I've always thought of it is that this game sort of looks at the danger of love, as a feeling, right? What so we always sort of celebrate love as like this positive thing that is good, but like when you love something, what happens when someone tries to take that from you? And that you see that over and over again in those shade stories. You see that, of course, with Yona and what's happening there, and what that looks like. And I would love to continue to talk about Nier, but we're going to revisit it in a second here, because I think that its ending is a great sort of look at that, like, ending D, which we'll come back to in a minute here. But then I think Nier Automata takes that same concept of like the danger of things you love, and then it sort of expands it out to being about more than just that. I think it's the danger of belief, the danger of, we have all these robots who like believe in religion or believe that the other side is evil. You have all these, at some point, Pascal is reading some philosophy book by Nietzsche, I think. And Pascal says, like, either this is like the most brilliant thing I've ever read or it's all nonsense. And I think that Taro would argue that it's nonsense because he's on record as saying, as being a complete absurdist, which is that, which is a philosophy sort of maybe popularized by Camus in the 1950s, that all of this life like it's like doesn't matter. There's no meaning to be found, and I think Taro here actually sort of expands that idea from the original Near to like the pursuit of meaning, and like the desire to find meaning all the time is actually sort of troubling and problematic. So it gets back to that cube idea you were talking about earlier too, Ben. But also Nier Automata is brilliant on so many levels, but to me, like, the philosophy of it and the way it advances Nier's philosophy is really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that interview that came out recently, he talks a little bit about how he kind of approached the storytelling of Nier Automata, and he says in it that he kind of set out to make a really complex story that would confuse the player at the beginning, and that you wouldn't really understand the kind of motivations of the player or the characters in the world, and that those would be slowly revealed to you over time, and that you'd spend a lot of the initial period confused. And he was trying to create an experience that he would find confusing, which I think is really interesting because you do kind of have that. He contrasted it to like Nier or Drakengard, where the motivations or the core goal that the player is striving for, the characters are striving for, is very clear. Even though you have these kind of other aspects of the world revealed to you over time, you kind of know what the thing is that you're in pursuit of or trying to accomplish. And Automata, is he kind of said that he developed that narrative in opposition to that, to like give you a completely different experience. And I think it does a really great job of that. And it's probably why it's been so enduring in popularity, because you are kind of like very confused at the beginning, and as you there's something really satisfying as you continue and get all of the endings like kind of reveal more and more of the truth of the world and the motivations and everything.
What else might be confusing to listeners is that we just skipped a game,
Yeah.
which is
I
my
was gonna
mistake.
say.
Sorry.
That's my mistake. I'm the one who did it. So, listeners, I'm not going to edit that. I think it's funny. We're going out of order. We'll come back to Automata, but there is one game before Automata after Nier. I thought of the transition. I'm like, I'm going to go for it. Before Automata comes out, and he makes Drakengard 3, which comes out I think in 2013. Which those of you who listen to the Drakengard episodes, I will say that I personally enjoyed Drakengard 3 much more than the first Drakengard. And only partially because Zero is sort of like a kind A minus, I'll say, in that she is extremely foul in everything she says. And shout out to the localizers, whoever localized like the stuff that Zero says and anything in Drakengard 3 and in the original Nier. Those text adventures are so rich, and Kaine's use of profanity is Shakespearean. Drakengard 3, I think an interesting contrast sort of in the middle of Nier and Nier Automata to sort of show like him going back to making a video game that to some degree, and all of his games are like this, but maybe to a larger degree than most, is sort of about the nature of video games themselves.
Mhm.
That's sort of my read on Drakengard 3, but yeah, I think that all of us here have at least dabbled in Drakengard 3, right?
Yeah, I think by far his funniest game.
Oh
Like
yeah.
it's maybe one of the funniest games ever made, especially in like this kind of genre. Like there's a lot of really good, like obviously point and click adventure games that are very funny, like some of the LucasArts stuff, or like Disco Elysium, for example, is a very funny game. But I would put Drakengard 3 kind of up there in terms of a game that really has the ability to like make you laugh with like the absurdity of the situations and the characters and the kind of interplay between them, and is willing to go some places with that like games really don't do. And I don't know if it's always successful, but it is like very entertaining the whole way through.
Yeah, I don't love this game. I do really like the last leg of it. Like once you start getting into like the branches, I enjoy it quite a bit.
Mhm.
But up until then, like okay, I started off like liking the game. I'm like, okay, the combat feels pretty solid for like a character action game. The humor is funny, and I was enjoying it for the first couple hours, but then, like literally up until ending A, like you're not really getting character development. It's just crude humor and sex jokes like the entire time. It's like nonstop, and a lot of them are funny, but after a while, it really did just start to grate in a way. And like the campy kind of tone is like it's fun. It's like reminds me a lot of a Suda 51 game actually, like the writing
Mhm.
style.
Yeah, yeah, it is very similar. Yeah.
Um, but it's just like I'm like, how is this a Drakengard game? Like it just felt like such a departure from what Yoko Taro is trying to do with Drakengard 1, and I feel like so here he's credited in the game credits as creative director rather than director. Like the only games where he's credited as full director are Drakengard, Nier, and Nier Automata. And I wonder if like that's part of it here because like although the gameplay here is pretty fun, and like yeah, it just works better as like just a regular action game. Like there was nothing too unique about it or subversive about how it was incorporated that kept me interested the same way Drakengard 1 and the OG Nier did. So but once it did start getting into like the branching paths and it opened up kind of the world building and character development, I did start appreciating it quite a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I totally see your perspective on that. From my perspective, at least with this game, like I think that Taro or the team, however you want to put it, goes through and they take all these tropes, all these ideas, all these things that you see in the kind of game that Drakengard is, or the kind Drakengard 3 is, or the kind of game that it's trying to tell, or kind of story it's trying to tell, and it turns everything up to 11. It's like, okay, we have like these sort of like pervy, like sort of anime like people. Let's make them as ridiculous as possible. Let's take that and make it not even turn it up to 15 in like the old guy's case, turn it up to like 35.
Oh my god,
Um,
Octa, he's the
yeah,
best.
yeah, Okta, who like has so many different ways of describing uh penises that I had never thought of before, or the sex act in general. And I'm like, I need to add these to my repertoire because while I just turned 40, I definitely have a very juvenile sense of humor sometimes.
Yeah,
Um,
some of them I just have written down here include full deployment,
okay,
grinding the whetstone, and his staff of miracles. So
Staff of
it's just
Miracles is a good one.
yeah.
You sort of see like, because like as I'm playing it the first time, and I played the DLC as well, which is ridiculously overpriced for the record.
Yeah,
Don't
super
do it.
expensive.
Like I
Yeah,
spent
yeah.
$30 on it, which is more than I spent on the game itself. It sort of like looks at like all the intoners, and it looks at their backstory, and you sort of see them as, again, like sort of like these anime trope girls, and then it sort of like digs under the surface in the DLC of like what these tropes that are turned all the way up kind of look like. I think in particular, the fourth intoners DLC is very disturbing.
Hmm.
um she ends up becoming like she's the virginal one, and she's a maniacal murderer, I'll just say that.
Oh.
She's absolutely insane. And so I think that the way that he is playing with trope and then saying like, what is the absolute debauchery that must be underneath that, is really, to me, really, really, really interesting. It's funny enough sort of on the surface, but I think you're right too, Alex. Like, you have to play the DLC. You have to get through, like, what's that guy's name who just likes pain all the time?
Decadus.
Decadus.
Yeah,
Oh
he actually
my
turns
god.
out to be like a really nice, like kind of like caring, nice guy in his way, right? So, but yeah,
I
I need you to stop that right now, sir.
every time
uh,
he did that, I lost my mind.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's like it ends up being really funny, but also tonally like wildly dark and wildly upsetting in some ways, and it's just like pure video game madness to me. To me, it's just like the purest form of looking at video game. It's the most meta of any of his games,
Hmm.
where every time she gets to a platforming section, it's so funny. Zero has the exact same feelings about most things I don't like in video games. She gets just like all these freaking platform sections. I hate it. Like, why are we doing this? How do these cubes work? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And then someone's like, well, as usual, it's magic. And no one explains how it works. And I think that it's the most surface level game that I've ever played, and in some ways the least surface level. I think it's like a really cognitively odd game.
Hmm.
Especially when you're supposed to have like this smooth, powerful combat, and it runs at occasionally 1 frame a second. Where I'm like, what is even happening around me? Luckily, the game's not very hard, so it's not too much of an issue. But oh my goodness,
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting, like Drakengard 3 in comparison to Drakengard 1, because they're almost in some ways like opposites of each other. In the sense that like Drakengard 1 is such like a humorless game up until like the end, where it becomes so dark and absurd that it almost becomes like funny at
Yeah.
times.
Like all
And
you can do is laugh.
yeah, and like Drakengard 3 is like the opposite. Like it starts out like very funny and not taking itself very seriously. And then by the end, when you go through the different endings and have, all the things revealed by the characters, it's like very heartbreaking and heart-wrenching and deep, kind of, in a way that when it started, it was just like so absurd and goofy. And I think they kind of complement each other nicely in that way. Like you kind of arrive at a similar place, but the way to get there is just so different tonally. And I love like how they kind of reinvent some of the concepts from the first Drakengard. Like the relationship between Zero and Mikhail, the dragon, is like so, I think, is so funny, and is such like an interesting like reversal from like Kime and Angelus, right? Because like instead of this like powerful, domineering, like self-righteous like dragon, you have this like, he's like a little kid doing like little kid things and like constantly trying to get Zero's approval, and she's just like smacking him down like every time. It's just such a funny dynamic that contrasts so well with the first game, I think.
Yeah, and also the times that like they're making like sex jokes, like all the disciples, and then
Yeah, he doesn't
Mikhail's just
understand.
like, it's like,
Yeah.
can I get in on it? And it's like, oh my god. But yeah, despite my criticism of the game, I do love Mikhail. I think he's like absolutely the heart of the game.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Adds so
Yeah.
much to it, and by the end, like he ends up being like such a crucial part to what makes the story become meaningful.
Hmm.
And it's interesting. I agree with the ways that you were describing Drakengard 3 as kind of a reversal of Drakengard. I also see it as a reversal of Nier in a lot of ways, especially in terms of that like theme of perspective we were talking about. Because here it's like you're playing a protagonist who at first just seems like a psychopath who's just out to kill for kind of the fun of it. But then as more perspective becomes revealed, like that ends up being subverted even. And I don't want to get into any spoilers, but yeah, it's like clearly a response not only to Drakengard but to Nier in a way.
Hmm.
I found the gameplay engaging enough that I was engaged enough to get to that point. I think that most of the like unlock requirements are simpler. I didn't feel like I was having to like like do those absurd things for weapon unlock requirements like in Drakengard, which again you could say is like less sort of interesting in some ways, but I don't know. I could deal with a little less friction at times. And I think that for the most part, the game trolls you less than Drakengard does, or even other Taro games do. But then you get to the ending, which I'll just kind of say what it is generally. It's a rhythm game. If you've finished the original Drakengard, it's sort of like that, but it's like 1,000 times harder. And the original Drakengard one wasn't exactly easy, and it is completely absurd. If you actually look at the trophy lists on like PlayStation, you'll be like 30% of people unlocked Route D, and then like 7% of people actually beat Route D. And like I had to cheat. My wife was the one who actually ended up doing it. And it took us hours. It was so absurd, but it's the ultimate troll job where it's like, if you really want to finish this game, here, have fun in probably the game and probably like the game where the gameplay is like the least varied of any of these Taro games, then it goes wildly in a different direction. But I
Yeah,
still liked it.
and I think on that, like the only reason I could come up with like why include like a final boss like that is I think like Yoko is very interested in why people put in the time and effort to play video games in the first place. And I think we see that manifested in the insane unlock conditions for Drakengard 1, in that you have to play half of Nier like at least 3 times to be able to like see the full context of the story. And here you just have like this insane challenge that's like, okay, if you want to see like the final ending of this game, here's this insane challenge to work through. But I feel like a lot of people end up getting more meaning out of the experience because he directed it that way. If that makes sense. He Because like video games can be kind of like trivial challenges, and then we have like kind of this world saving ending to them. But if you put like the player through like real kind of work, and you ask them, hey, if you want to like, if you care about this story, if you care about this world, here's some work to do. And then people get some fulfillment out of that. It seems like despite the controversial nature of all these things, like clearly Yoko Taro's work has had an impression on them.
Now we'll really go to Automata, and here's my transition. Speaking of controversial, I think probably one of the most controversial things about Drakengard 3 is just Zero's character design. um, which, and we didn't even get into all the other weird stuff with the lore. Like it goes wild at times. Like the seeds of destruction come back in interesting ways. There's this character who I think sort of appears in all the way into reincarnation,
We're
who's
talking
sort
about a
of like,
chord.
yeah, who's sort of sitting over things. Which again, when I was talking about it being like so video gamey, like it kind of reminded me like a chord is like me, sort of like tracking these different endings and how you want do these different unlocks and just the very meta narrative elements of it. But point is, Zero's character design is very sexualized, and all the obviously sex is hugely important to the narrative of Drakengard 3. And I originally thought that it was going to be like have something to say about it, but it really didn't, which I kind of appreciated. I thought was kind of funny. But obviously 2B's character design, obviously controversial as well. Lots and lots of people are like, I think Nier Automata is one of the greatest games of all time, but like 2B's character design to the point to where like people were like, oh, here's the reason why 2B is like so hot. And then Yoko Taro's like, no, I like pretty girls. um, but I think that the way that he sort of like has like sort of these contrasts of of who he is as a thinker and how his humor works as opposed to the depth of his philosophy creates a sort of tonal clash. But I do think that it's sort of perfected in Automata.
Yeah, he in that interview he says that like every character that he writes or creates is like a part of himself, and his approach to like designing or creating a character is like different every he takes a different approach every time, but it's always like some aspect of himself that he's putting into the character, which I mean I think is yeah, I mean I think that's typical for writers, you know, but I think it's interesting that he kind of has that approach. And what he said about 2B is specifically that he came up with like what she looked like first, and then let that inform kind of how the character would develop. And I think you can kind of like see that in like her design and the reaction to her design and his comments about it. But he's kind of like unapologetic about that, which in some ways is kind of refreshing, I guess, even if there is like criticisms to be had about that aspect of Dragon Guard 3 and Nier Automata and stuff. Like it is he's pretty just like upfront about how, you know, those characters come to be and why he did things that way.
Real quick about sexualization and objectification of the ladies. I have complicated feelings about it because I like, yeah, in some ways it's like, oh, Yoko Taro is just a perv, but then it's also kind of like this is an industry and culture thing, and is he pointing it out not necessarily to critique it, but to at least be like, hey y'all, this is what we're doing. And by we, it's not just him and his game. So like okay, I have okay, 2B, did he make her appealing just okay, like we need to make an appealing android chick, or like if you just think about like the discourse and dialogue around it, like how much of that has to do with the fandom? Like I'm sorry, but like she doesn't look all that different from a lot of standard anime and video game female protagonists. Like, yes, she's objectified. Yes, she's sexualized. So are a bazillion other people. Like, Tomb Raider sold itself on the existence of Lara Croft's boobs. I'm sorry, that's just true. Right? Like, so it's not like he did something particularly different. The fandom seems to have made a great deal of stuff around it, which that part creeps me out more
Yeah.
than like Taro's like, oh, I want to have like an attractive woman as the protagonist. Now there are other things like that made me feel a little more like skeevy, like there's like a trophy or an achievement for trying to use the camera angle to like look up 2B's skirt.
You're allowed. We'll get to this in a second. You're allowed to buy trophies in that game, like just like in-game currency.
Yeah, I
And
actually bought that one
that's the
too.
only one that I bought. I was
Yeah,
like, I'm not doing that.
yeah. I think like you also can do it with 9S though.
Oh,
So
okay.
uh equal opportunity offensiveness. I
Yeah,
don't know what 9S is packing, but yeah, there's that. He's in his swimsuit. Yeah, it's like you can get him a swimsuit and then try to look and he gets all sheepish the same way 2B's like, hey, quit looking.
yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of like what I'm getting at with like his comments about how he creates characters and how they're kind of a reflection of himself. Like you, even though there is like a pretty big degree some of the characters like character designs and stuff of maybe like objectification, you're also like I think he truly does view all of the characters that he's created as like aspects of himself, and like putting himself into each of those characters. And there's also so much more to those characters than just the way that they look or the way that they're presented. And that, I think, kind of does change how those characters are kind of accepted by the audience, or like my perspective on them. Like there is that element, but there's always more than just that element to them. Whereas if you were to compare that to something like, I don't know, like Quiet from Metal Gear Solid 5, for example, which maybe is a character that doesn't quite have the depth that some of Yoko Taro's characters have. Like it's definitely like an aspect worth criticizing, but there is more to those characters than just um, that kind of sexualized aspect, I guess.
From a broader perspective, that's sort of what he does with 9S as well, right? Like, so like
Hmm.
to be is presented as like sort of this ice queen, sort of like hot ice queen, right? Who's just like, oh yeah, whatever, whatever. I'm not going to call you nines, blah blah blah. And then it turns out it's because she has been gone through like the sort of this torturous cycle of what she has to do. And I won't spoil what it is, but this torturous cycle of what her job is.
Hmm.
And 9S, who is like, oh, this nice boy who, like, sort of in the back of your mind, he's like, man, that dude really hates machines, like, a lot. It's kind of weird. Um, and then he becomes, some might argue, not me necessarily, but some might argue, sort of a villainous character by the time the ending is rolling around, because the thing that he believed in, that he loved, is taken away from him. Not just who he cares about, but also his whole belief system is flipped upside down, and it just becomes like pure rage. So I guess my general point is that uh, that's one of the things he does. I mean, we didn't talk about this with Kaine, but Kaine is the same way, right? Like she's like this rage filled profanity machine, but there's all this stuff going underneath. And that sounds like it's sort of just like standard storytelling, but I think Taro again is taking it to such extremes that he sort of forces you to engage with the tropes in a way that a lot of other creators don't do.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's why his characters are so enduring, despite maybe some of the more um, fantastical, absurd like aspects of their design, is because there is that kind of depth to all of them. And even if it may not always feel like there's a the the purpose behind their design is always justified, there is an attempt, or there is something more going on there, and that kind of, I don't know, I think makes them received differently than maybe you would find other characters in other games with like similar design, but maybe not the kind of thematic and emotional depth that you get in his work.
Yeah, because even though like some of the visual designs like can come off as like very like male gazy, like the more you get to know the character, there's also like elements of like queerness in these characters
Hmm.
as well, right? Like Kaine
Yeah.
is canonically like intersex, right? That's revealed in kind of like one of her short stories, and
Hmm.
like
Emil is
there's
gay.
yeah,
Yeah.
Emil's gay, and then there's a lot of like kind of like queer relationships you see like among like the androids in Automata, because like they just don't have the same kind of like hang-ups around sexuality that like humans have, so it like just comes across very naturally to them to have like queer relationships. So like I don't know if that like excuses the like just clear male gazy aspects of the designs, but it is like an additional element you gotta like at least account for, right?
Yeah, and I think those are all aspects of like that Taro kind of like sees in himself, and he's very open. I think through his work you can kind of see this openness of like critique of himself and critique of people and the way people interact with each other and the way that we kind of construct our narratives about the world. And I think that that kind of constant um, critique or recontextualization, or questioning of those kind of perspectives and narratives are kind of what makes it easier to swallow, right? Because he's not a creator that like shies away from criticism of his own work, or his own characters, or the kind of worldview that is kind of either espoused or that he's kind of taking on. And I think that that kind of makes it more presents a sense that like he's open to those kind of interpretations, and he's not afraid to like have criticism of his work, and he welcomes it in a way, which I think makes it easier to kind of accept those aspects, even if they aren't always the best, or you might not agree with them.
Yeah, and also what
Yeah.
makes me like buy more into what Pat was saying, that like it's like for the video games, like as a consequence of like the fan bases, and trying to
Mhm.
like market it and trying to get people to just buy the game. Like I have no doubt that people bought the game because of how 2B looks. Um,
Oh, I'm
but
sure like half the
yeah,
sales. That's not even really an exaggeration. It wouldn't have happened
yeah.
if not for it.
But like you look at one of his stage plays, like Yorha Girls, which is a prequel to Automata, and the outfits, like the costumes in that play, don't have any of this like French maid sort of like sexualization to it. Like they are wearing like schoolgirl uniforms, the
Yeah, I was
Yorha
gonna say they have
members.
schoolgirl sexualization instead.
But it's like not like it's. I would say that's less sexualization. Like,
Yeah,
sure, there
I
might
agree.
still be an aspect there, but it's also just like the idea of like Yorha being just like kind of like a military group of like teenagers. Essentially, they don't have like full lives, but just like kind of falling into that sort of anime trope like makes more sense than them wearing French made outfits for some reason. And then like the rebels have like kind of this like Harajuku style like fashion sense to them. So like in this context outside of video games, like there was a different approach to the costumes is what I'm saying. So yeah, I feel like it does have to do somewhat with just like video game marketing.
Yeah, and I don't think he really shies away from that, like, I think he's very upfront about that, and, like, his work is just very multifaceted. You can appreciate it on that kind of shallow level, but there's also, like, a deeper level to appreciate, his
Yeah.
worlds and characters and the things that he puts together, and so, um, that is kind of I think that refusal to, like, make excuses for it is in some ways kind of endearing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, when you're thinking about the different parts of himself as you're talking about here, I think that this game, not even just from like a thematic perspective, which we've already kind of talked about, and also from just like a how is he dealing with his own ideas, but like I feel like almost every single element of it ends up working together in a way that is like sort of consistently fun, but also thematically rich.
Mhm.
Like we talked about 2B sort of being like this cool ice queen, and she when you're playing as her, she's just like so smooth and the game's pretty easy. Then he plays 9S and things obviously are less easy, but you then that the hacking kind of gets integrated in really well. And then I just feel like all the different gameplay systems and the way that he tells, I think that Alex sort of piece about the narrative design in this game, but I think it's the gameplay design sort of getting to that in a really interesting way here. And obviously he's been doing that since Drakengard. We've been talking about that since Drakengard, but here I feel like because Platinum's obviously working on this and helping with that, that it all really just kind of coheres into something really, really strong that's interesting, which gets to the sales issue, that I think really works in Automata.
Yeah, like you were saying, like the smoothness that the way our characters control, like it feels like integrated now with like the actually having like really polished gameplay that Platinum is capable of doing. But I also love like the extra bits of kind of like narrative design and the game's UI, like that your menu is essentially like accessing your android's operating system, and you're like equipping chips to like customize your
Or the reasons why
different
autosave
stats.
doesn't exist,
Yeah.
which I think is really cool.
Yeah, so it's just everything about Automata just feels like really thought out. It really just feels like a perfect um vision of Yoko Taro's approach to gameplay, and finally putting it into like a video game that just like feels like a really good video game.
And it's funny because I feel like Nier Automata has been talked about so much here by me and a lot of people. It's like, what else is there to say about it, right? We haven't talked about the music yet, but music here is amazing. It just feels like it coheres so well.
We've talked about it probably to death across other podcasts. I want to give a shout out to an opera singer who runs an amazing YouTube channel. You guys might know him, Marco Meatball.
He's done some really good work on Expedition 33 recently too.
Yes, he
So
has. Two
yeah,
weeks ago, he did a whole like 30-minute video on Near and Near Automata and the chaos language that Emmy Evans created and how it applies to sort of the theming and lore of the game, which I believe Yoko Taro asked her to craft a fictional language for the first Near. So for people who want a deep dive on that, I kind of want to just point them to that video. I think I mean, I've talked about it in writing, and I'm sure we've talked about it on the podcast, but you want a good resource on what's going on linguistically in the music and all the insanity there. Marco Meatball's new video is quite good for that, and I'd really encourage people to go check that out.
Yeah, he's just like so passionate too, and just seems so unpretentious. I never talked to this guy before in my life. He has no idea who I am, probably, but they're really worth watching. And yeah, I think that the chaos language stuff is really interesting when you get to some of the theming at the very end of it. And I'll talk more about some of the themes of the end of Automata. But again, I feel like Automata has been talked to death both here and a million other places. We probably don't need to talk about it a whole lot more. But there are some things we're starting to get into the point now to where like we're not going to spend as much time on these games because either they're not as important or he didn't direct any of these. In fact, probably the thing he had the heaviest hand in is the near raids in Final Fantasy 14. But at the same year that Automata comes out, Sino Alice or Sino Alice or Shino Alice, I don't know, comes out, and I haven't played it at all. But it's a mobile game, and I'm not really sure how some of his ideas are carried through here.
There's a style, and it might be more some of the writers that he has sort of worked with, the scenario writers, the story writers, um, that worked under him on Automata and other games. I think they're kind of key for both Shino Alice and Near Reincarnation in terms of like vignette style storytelling. Um, when you play through Shino Alice, like it's all of these classic fantasy Brothers Grimm sort of Black Forest stuff, much of which has been reinterpreted by Disney over the years. So we have Alice from Alice in Wonderland and Snow White and Cinderella. Over time, they added more characters. There were 8 originally. We learn about their stories, but all the stories are subvertive, they're darker, and then like in the second season of the game, they all the characters get like thrust and thrown into like modern day Tokyo, uh which feels a lot like a certain ending of a certain game we talked about before. In terms of gameplay, it was fairly boring. You you have a few characters, I think it was 4, and they have different classes, and then you just battled waves of enemies, usually 3 waves, and then at the end of each one of those little battles you would get um, fade to black and then some text and some artwork, and there would be 10 of those chapters to go through for each segment for each of the 8 protagonists. And then of course, like I said, they added more, and then they added additional seasons, and eventually it starts digging deep into how does this universe hold together. With the final season, it had to do more with like how does this universe even exist, who are Para and Noya, who are sort of like, we didn't talk about this much, but there's always sort of like guide or muse characters, like we think of Grimoire Vice, Pods 42 and Pod 153. In Near Reincarnation, it's a ghost with a sheet over her named Mama, and so in Shino Alice, Paranoia are kind of your guide or muse characters. Yeah, they become more and more important as you get near the end of Shino Alice. Now, both Shino Alice and Near Reincarnation are no longer playable. Their servers are fully shut down, but there are websites and Reddit forums and things where screenshots of the text components to all stories are 100% documented, thanks to the passion of the fandom. So you can definitely read your way through these games. And if you want to see what the gameplay was generally like, there are definitely YouTube videos of playthroughs of some of the key sections, especially the endings of both of those games.
Yeah, I played a bit of this game, so I don't have too much more to add. That was very thorough, Pat. But Yeah, from what I played, like the gameplay didn't feel like anything special. I did like kind of that vignette style storytelling that you could just like pick up this game for a little bit, play like one arc for one of these fairy tale characters, get a little bit of narrative development for them, and that was kind of cool. I think the presentation of that kind of vignette style storytelling is very much refined in Near Reincarnation, though. But with that said, like that's just clearly like an interesting concept, and I even like read that apparently this idea of a world being shaped by like fairy tale characters was actually what Yoko Taro originally had in mind for like Nier slash Drakengard 3 when he was first like hired for the job, but Square Enix kind of pushed him off of that idea because of kind of conceptual similarities to Kingdom Hearts. Although I'm to compare a Yoko Taro game to Kingdom Hearts is
What?
kind of hilarious
Yeah.
because they are ultimately very, very different things. But something that I saw with my limited experience with this game that kind of continues what he has been doing thematically is kind of conceptually conflating two things that are originally seen as different, like the way that we like the androids and humans and machine life forms are kind of slowly conflated throughout Nier Automata. Here we kind of like see the apparent differences between human beings and characters kind of conflated. Whereas these fairy tale characters are essentially fighting to try to revive their authors, but they end up kind of like losing themselves in the process a bit through this like kind of violent process. And ultimately, like they come to the conclusion that their life is predestined, and that seems to be sort of like doing a commentary about like how human beings don't actually have that much agency either. It's interesting, an interesting idea.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention that. Their initial goal, all of them, is they want to meet their author. It makes me think about like the motivation of the Fal'Cie in Final Fantasy 13. Like, bring back our god, bring back our
Mm.
maker. We need to meet him. We need his guidance. We need something. And so they're all kind of like, yeah, who wrote us? The answer is kind of like, nope. You are oral tradition and you just exist. And maybe that's not just for Snow White and Alice. Maybe that's for me and you, which is that's
I mean,
my takeaway.
that sounds about as Taro as I can imagine. It's just sort of again like sort of that sort of grasping at straws for meaning, and something to tell you, right? So that certainly sounds thematically relevant to me. And we'll talk about reincarnation in a second here, but actually, I think I mentioned this a second ago, but after Shino Alice actually comes out, I think in Japan the same year as Automata, which is crazy to think about. After Automata is so popular, he then goes on to work on a game that, again, listeners know that I'm very familiar with, Final Fantasy 14. And one of the things they'll do every sort of expansion is they will have an alliance raid. It's basically like a 24-man thing where you have like 3 sort of instance dungeons and a story that connects them. And interestingly, it is a sequel, like a direct sequel to like all things Drakengard and Nier. And I don't want to get too far into like because you have to get into all the lore of it. And it's all just kind of like kind of silly and kind of dumb. Like 2B shows up, 9S shows up, get some Drakengard stuff showing up. It's like all like Seeds of Destruction come back. It's all crazy and wild and weird. But the dwarves who are based on the Final Fantasy IV dwarves are like sort of at the center of all of this. And it's all like really goofy and dissonant. But I think to me, it's like this interesting thing that Taro does where he has like this really deep lore a lot of the time. Like if you go read some of the side stories, the short stories, or all this other stuff, like you can see that he's really kind of built these worlds. But he also plays with that lore and doesn't care about that lore. And this becomes more important in some of the next ones we're about to talk about, but he just kind of plays around with it in a way that like doesn't really matter, and that doesn't really function in any important way, and it's just like all so goofy. And one of my favorite things is to actually finish the story for the 14 raids with after the dwarves are gone and after we've kind of resolved the story there. which is fun, is that you have to do like, I don't remember how many weekly quests it is, but like these really tedious weekly quests to like kind of like get letters back from one of the dwarves who's left. And it's just like, and it's just dumb. Like it doesn't tell you anything. It doesn't wrap anything up in any sort of an interesting way. So you think about like how much tedium there is in an MMO. And he's like, all right, I'm in an MMO now. Now I'm going to kind of make fun of you going to do this like weekly thing, which is really big in all MMOs, and give you basically scraps of nothing as a result of it. I think it's hilarious. And I also didn't do it this time. So joke's on you, Yoko. I'm not doing it.
The plots behind the raids kind of remind me of some of the other sort of offshoot stuff they've done with Automata, like the concert, the 12024 concert series is also a sequel to Automata. It's like its own story of some things that happen immediately afterwards. And then, among the many novels that we never got in English, some of them are similar to that as well. So I will say that generally I kind of both love and hate that, like, the storytelling can go in all these different directions in all these different media and formats. I do think 14's content is more fleshed out than some of the other stuff that's been out there for Nier Automata. And I did enjoy watching what I've watched.
I mean, truthfully, it is actually the reason that I got into 14. Like we've been talking about it for so long. Like, oh my gosh, you gotta play 14, gotta play 14. Everyone on, so many people on staff. Now I'm one of them. It's like, oh, you gotta go play it. But it was like really Yoko Taro who convinced me to go over to it. And the raids themselves are fun and they're interesting and a lot of fun callbacks to Nier. But I think from a storytelling perspective, it might be the dumbest story they tell in Nier Automata. And I also think that might be on purpose, which I also think is hilarious. I know we've talked a little bit about Nier Reincarnation, but I do think that because it really is like a sequel to Nier, and I don't want to get too much into the story. I know a little bit because Pat wrote about it. Near Reincarnation is something that I always kind of wanted to play, but I haven't. And I know that Aleks has a fair amount of experience with it, and I know Pat, you have a ton of experience with it. So, from sort of a direct perspective of reincarnation, sort of how do we see Taro's ideas sort of continuing forward there? Even though I know that he's not director there, he's sort of like overseeing people, which is sort of a theme of the last decade for him.
Yeah, so Reincarnation is I think actually a very interesting game. And in the same way that they have that Octopath Traveler 0 on the way that is kind of building from the Champions of the Continent mobile game. Um, Seems to be a different story, certainly a different protagonist, but working within that world and framework. An offline version of Reincarnation, I think, could be really good. You would have to retool the battle system
Yeah,
entirely because the battle system
I
is
would
not fun.
I would do some things to make that happen. Some things I'm not proud of. So yeah, I agree.
The stories alone are great. Everything takes place in this sort of this world that is both contained and also like stretching out vast, called the Cage. The first two main characters are this person that's first just called the Monster, and you learn later his name is Lavania, and a little girl named Theo, and they're guided by Mama the ghost. You are accessing these records from within the cage to different stories that take place in different times, potentially different timelines. Um, but clearly, as you play through them, uh, some of them are definitely in the Draconeer world. There are clockwork soldiers in some of them. There are adventures that clearly seem to take place in the realm of like the contained world of like Near Gestalt and Replicant. Uh, there's um, there's some stuff that plainly ties back to Drakengard 3 in some of the character stories, but there's a total of, let's see, there's six in the first season. There's three seasons. There's six in the first season, another six in the second season. I guess it's eight in the first season because you have to count Theo and Lavania themselves. And then the third season, they introduce an android named 10H, and her story does not take place within the cage. And so the final season, which players had about 6 months before the server shut down to play, the ending of this game, it ties all of these really sort of interesting, fun, and again, vignette style character stories to what's actually happening with like the near timeline and near automata specifically. I don't know how much to spoil. I go spoiler heavy in that article that you mentioned on RPG Fan. I called it the end of service, and it's a near reincarnation retrospective. Um, but yeah, it's real. I think it's a really cool game. Just because you travel into so many worlds and see so many different perspectives, and then there's sort of a meta story for the characters that you control in each season. So there's all sorts of cool stuff. Gets into multiverse stuff, and it also ties back to ending E of the Near Replicant remake. And though I do think there are some interesting things that go, like there were some cool challenges in the battle format that if you really got into it, it could be fun. For the most part, yeah, it would have to be seriously retooled for it to be a fun game in like a single player offline purchase this for $60 kind of game.
Yeah, so I didn't even get through all of Act 1. My experience with this game was pretty limited. And when I looked up more at in terms of like what happens in Act 2 and especially Act 3, it blew my mind because what you experience in Act 1 does not feel connected to the near universe in any explicit way, really. Like I'd say like they got the tone right between like the visual design and like the music, obviously. But like in terms of like how this lore is ultimately connected, like apparently Yoko Taro didn't, when he started development for Reincarnation, he wasn't sure how the story would ultimately connect to the larger universe, which is crazy in retrospect because the way he managed to pull it off, from everything I know about what happens later in this game, is incredible. Like I didn't think like it would he would be able to find like a satisfying way in order to connect the Drakengard and Nier franchises in a way that kind of makes sense, and he did it, which is really, really impressive. But yeah, like the moment of game to moment gameplay of what I experienced was kind of interesting, but not fun. Like navigating just like the 3D space, while like dialogue ensued was kind of vibey, kind of fun. The vignettes I think were definitely the highlight, where like the game goes into like these 2D, very like almost like painted sort of settings as like the story takes place. But all you're doing as a player is kind of like walking left or right. But the way it unfolds, the presentation of it was legitimately impressive, and I hope they do end up porting it. Yeah.
That's a big jump in quality from Shino Alice to
Yeah.
Near Reincarnation, is that even though you would think just walking left and right in this sort of silhouetted, sort of stylized 2D space, you would think, oh, that's not much better than just reading the text. No, it ends up like working really well, just walking in these spaces and having story unfold is really cool. And then at the very end of the game, when you get those kind of stories, and suddenly it's like all of the characters, like it's so cool. And then going back to the 3D can work well, though I think also that can be a bit of a slog. You're just walking down various hallways, and then they're talking as you sort of explore the cage, and that feels a little bit like running in Final Fantasy 13, if you get my drift.
Yeah, the only
But
thing that adds to it, I feel, is that classic Yoko Taro game, kind of like camera movement, sometimes makes it feel a little more interesting. But yeah, it could definitely use some more mechanics.
yeah, the fixed camera that allows you to sort of see the sights as you walk through, and see how the world is changing from one act to the next. And I don't even want to spoil what happens in Act 3. Like it's so, yeah, it's genius. It's genius. I can't even. It's so thematically rich. It's like really on, the storytelling is really on par with the other Near games, and people just don't know because it was put in one of my least favorite forms, the gotcha mobile games I kind of hate, but they wrote a good story for it.
yeah, I look forward to finding a way to play it because like I read your article, but like I read it kind of quickly, so that I was like, oh, maybe eventually. And I'm like, I could watch videos, but like, no, I'd like to play the game. So we'll see how what's going on. I know that Taro's working on something, and we'll see if that's related. Um, but I'm glad you brought up the Kaine thing, and how important it is. And I don't want to go too much into sort of near replicant 1.22 XYZ 1000. I don't know.
To the
Um,
power of 5.
but the reason I'm kind of talking about it separately from the original Near, because it comes out I think the same year that Replicant or that Reincarnation does. The reason I want to talk about it separately, not just like that, it's sort of like it's more accessible from a gameplay perspective while still maintaining a lot of the tedium that is thematically important to what's going on with the game. But there are two things that are added that are kind of enormous to it. One is there's a section with the mermaid that originally Taro had written, and then he's like, I knew it was never going to get used. It gets added in. It's really interesting. But to me, Ending E, which I don't want to spoil, but it was originally a short story that Taro wrote, sort of, and I actually think it was basically always supposed to be like sort of a canonical ending E. They add it into this new version of Replicant, and it gets back to the thing that Ben was talking about earlier about the cube, about how like you kind of go back to it and you see that this is one thing that needs to be sort of adjusted, that clay cube. And I've always thought that the ending of the original Near, which I don't want to give it away, but is so much more engaging in Near Automata because he pulls off sort of a similar trick. But I think that trick is sort of thematically beautiful in Automata, and it's kind of just like you have to make a sacrifice in the original Near. One of the things that I think Automata's ending E does is that it sort of implies that like the connections we have with each other are potentially something that we should be cautious of. Because I'll just say, from a broad perspective, ending E literally asks you at some point, will you sacrifice yourself for someone you might not even like? And it gets back to that idea of perspective and things like that we've talked about a lot. But it also, to some degree, I think, rejects the notion of human connection or even belief as something that we should maybe invest in, at least from my perspective. But then ending E comes in from Replicant, the remaster of it, and I think it sort of pushes back against that a little bit. It says like, no, Kaine really cared about this person, and that care matters. And even though the result of that care is really catastrophic, and obviously, if we see it in Reincarnation, I'd be curious to know what that is. But we know it's really catastrophic, but it doesn't mean that the connection that Kaine and Emil and Nier, or whatever you want to call him, had doesn't matter. It just means that there are consequences to it. And so to me, I think that it's really thematically interesting. But I'm not sure who else is familiar with the story or what their thinking is on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, we talk so much about um, what it means to fight against anything to get what you want. And Kaine wants someone back, and she wants the memory of him back. And I mean, that is a core theme in the whole Nier series. The fact that the games are still called Nier is really interesting when you think about it. I really like Ending E. I'm really glad it exists. And I think it makes sense that she would not tolerate this loss. And I think, we as players want to hold on to our stories and our memories, and we want to uh fight to hold on to that which we see as dear. And there is this sort of meta narrative around, like, can you keep it or can you not? And the fact that Near Reincarnation is no longer playable, all the servers are down. Like, if I'm protesting for the game to come back, am I like Kaine, who's like, give me back my friend?
To kind of touch very briefly on something else before we move on to Voice of Cards, and we're almost done here, is like I think that what he does with Reincarnation or with a Replicant 1 point whatever, is sort of similar to what he does with a lot of his work. And again, it gets to that idea that Ben was talking about. Like we talked about Yorha Girls, the stage play, but it's actually originally a stage play called Yorha Boys, and it takes place somewhere a little bit different. And it was eventually novelized. And there was another stage play that even like predates Nier Automata, that's called Pearl Harbor, that has been like revamped, like I think like literally 5 times as a stage play, and it like changes little characters here, little characters there, little characters here, little characters there, and it's been turned into a manga where the story is a little bit different, and it's been turned into a portion of the anime where the story is a little bit
I was
different.
going to
And I
say the
think,
Pearl Harbor sequence is turned into
yeah,
2 episodes of the anime, which is
right.
totally worth watching.
Yeah, I agree with, and I think the anime is one of the interesting things about like the anime and the stage plays is I think you can see that Taro is a video game storyteller, and those stories don't work as well for me outside of it. But to me, what's really interesting about it is the way that he is willing, not just within the game where you're kind of like doing things over and over again, but also in the stories that he's told in general, to kind of George Lucas it, but also just make it alternative storytelling or storylines, and kind of just like keep adjusting that clay cube. I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying, Zach, like that approach where he keeps going back to the same themes and the same ideas and often the same characters and concepts. Like, I think part of why the games just work so much better is not only because that's his core competency, right, that he's built over his career, but I also think that as a medium, like games just lend themselves more to that revisiting and remixing and recontextualizing something that you've done before. And you can kind of I think you can just do a lot more with that, with the interactive element, than what you can in like other mediums that aren't interactive. And so that, I hope that he kind of returns and does more game projects, because that's really, I think, where his kind of abilities and storytelling abilities shine the most, is in that interaction between the player and the world of the game. And it's interesting, in that interview that he recently gave, he talks about generative AI, and while I don't agree with necessarily his take on it, he does kind of see like a future where he talks about how interactivity with games is very limited right now. And he's talks about looking towards a future where you can have a much more complex and deep interaction between the player in a game that kind of changes based on the whims or desires of the player. And he gives the example of like, if a certain player is more attuned to a certain type of game, like an action game, or more attuned to more of a narrative adventure game, then the game could mold or change shape to fit that. And I don't know that we're ever going to get there, but I think it's interesting that he is thinking about those things. And even though I disagree that technology is going to enable that, I think does speak to his like kind of visionary perspective, that he is thinking that deeply about the future of interactivity in games, and that he's always trying to kind of butt up against the limits of what you can do with interactivity.
Yeah, and I think that when you're thinking about it from uh, like, because I feel like you see it most in the other kinds of storytelling he's done, but I think that I agree with everything you're saying about AI, but like sort of that he wants to make games like that is
Hmm.
really cool, and I think it's really interesting. But I think what's maybe the most interesting in some ways is that the most recent games that he's worked on, just as creative director, are games that like are as simple as they can be.
Hmm.
You can't play them some other way. They are literally just like very standard turn-based RPGs, which they are really like the most RPG of anything he's made, or at least been involved in making, and that is the Voice of Cards series, which he still functions as creative director on. And I want to kind of talk about all three of them together. I realize that there are different things about each one, but we've been going for a while here. The Voice of Cards series, I think, is sort of like where, from a broad perspective, is sort of where he sits as a creator now, where he sort of sits over people, and you can see other people imitating his style and sort of doing things in a similar way. And he sort of, I think he makes jokes about it all the time. That he like takes naps and eats snacks while while the young people are doing the work. Um, and like the first Voice of Cards takes like a story that is like straight out of Dragon Quest, and then it inverts it. The second Voice of Cards is actually, I think, very Drakengard. in the way that
Mm.
it's telling its stories, in the relationship between the maidens and the guys, but it's not. There's not some like huge twist at the end. I mean, like the twist that there is like very obvious. Beast of Burden is the only one that I have not completed. I think it's the most mechanically interesting, but I'm guessing if the character designs are anything to go by, that it's the most near, but it's also the one that he's worked on the most. So I'm not sure like what sort of thoughts you guys have on Voice of Cards and how his most recent work really is reflective of him.
Well, I think going back to that kind of interactivity piece that he seems really interested in now, like I think it's interesting that Voice of Cards takes that like tabletop game kind of like presentation and approach, because it's that I think, and I think you're seeing this with like a lot of especially veteran game designers like have gone to this in the past, or like that influence from like a tabletop role playing game, because the level of interactivity, even though it's like so rudimentary in technology, is there the possibilities of like interactivity between the player and the game are so like vast, basically limitless. And so I think that you maybe that is kind of the genesis of this like Voice of Cards idea, to like bring some of that like tabletop element to games. But I think the reality of the, and I've only played the first Voice of Cards, but it is like very like it's like pretty limited. So I don't know that that actually like ended up working out necessarily, but it is an interesting idea, and I think that is something like that I think is just a trend in general in the industry, like the kind of breaking down the barriers between like a tabletop game and a digital like video game, and trying to kind of marry those aspects together. Um, and I think that's the most interesting thing I find about those games.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also like an economic decision, right? Like there's
Hmm.
this weird period in the early 2020s. I feel like it's over now, where Square Enix was just like pushing out a lot of titles with lower budgets, but that were
Hmm.
meant to appeal to um, kind of like veteran RPG players, and I feel like Voice of Cards is one of them. Because if you look at the credits of these games, they are quite tiny, and judging by the presentation, they were also not expensive to develop at all. They all only have one voice actor, who's the narrator and also like your GM essentially, who guides you through the experience. But I do think at their best, it uses it to really interesting effect where you just have like kind of this presentation of levels and villages and the world as kind of cards that become flipped over as you're kind of progressing. It's like a fog of war type effect that it's honestly pretty satisfying.
Hmm.
Um, and there will just be like pauses for like little cutscenes, but the cutscenes will just like all be delivered by your game master. And when the game master is good, which for the English voice cast I think is best in Beasts of Burden, the Forsaken Maiden one, the English voice actor I absolutely hated, so I had to change it to the Japanese one, who was much
I,
much
I
better.
think the one in Beast of Burden is really fun. She plays around with it too. She's like, "Oh man, this guy talks a lot."
Yeah, yeah. But this idea that like the kind of like narrative sort of immersion we're looking for in RPGs can just be accomplished through one voice actor and interesting and engaging writing that like lets you as the player kind of fill in the blanks, like kind of like add color from your own imagination like an old pixel art title would do. I think is really clever. And
Hmm.
just adding to your assessment of the game, Zach, I think you were right on the money with Forsaken Maiden playing into like the Drakengard's legacy, with this idea that like you're just traveling through these different towns, and there's always like there's this big emphasis on like these maidens that need to on a cycle just like sacrifice themselves to keep their town alive. And they're all like accompanied by like an attendant, and you get these your party's constantly switching in this game between your main character and kind of his maiden, and also the maiden and the attendant of each new town you visit, and they all kind of have like different relationships with each other that I think are explored in pretty interesting ways. And
It was interesting that the first maiden and the first intoner from Drakengard 3, like almost the same relationship in
yeah,
terms of how the
true.
attendant felt about the woman he was working for.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. So yeah, I think like it also added mechanically a lot. Like this game has like character double attacks, like the way you get in like Chrono Trigger. So each maiden and attendant pair have like these special attacks if you build up enough of your little like pebbles that you get with like each turn and that are incorporated to the game mechanics. I think Forsaken Maiden was definitely the most mechanically satisfying in terms of like balance, I would say. But then Beasts of Burden, I think conceptually how it incorporates the card mechanic into its storytelling and its gameplay is easily the best. I think this is the peak of the series, and if a listener is only to play one, I would definitely recommend Beasts of Burden because it essentially like flips the monster catching mechanic on its head. Like this whole series kind of like conflates humans and monsters in that way that we see happen a lot with Yoko Taro and like the quote unquote like good guys and the quote unquote bad guys. But here you're actually like capturing them and it kind of like exposes monster catching for what it is, which is essentially like you're enslaving these creatures. And it does a lot of like interesting storytelling with that. And it also like the fact that you're always getting new monsters through the gameplay makes like the turn-based combat less grating because you're constantly like at least like earning new and like better monster cards, which in the context of the narrative is pretty dark, but in the context of the gameplay is pretty engaging.
Yeah, I think kind of the benefit to having a more limited and scope and budget game like this is that it kind of paradoxically there's actually like a more immediacy between concept and like between concepts that you want to introduce in the game and then the ability for the player to like experience those concepts. I think with like high fidelity games where you're building all these assets and you're building this huge like 3D world, there becomes a lot of work and distance between the core concept and idea that you're trying to bring to the player and the player themselves. And there's just so much more that goes into that and it work and labor that's required to like get that done. And I wonder if that is something that Yoko Taro experienced like making Near and Near Automata in particular with the kind of genre shifting and everything and how much work must have gone into like having the game switch to another completely different style of gameplay and how much time it takes to actually implement something like that and where maybe the appeal of games like these voice of cards games is that you can have a concept like that or new concepts, and you can introduce them relatively quickly and easily with a small team. And that to me is something that I think is probably pretty like appealing to a game designer, like that you don't have all the burdens that come with like high fidelity game development with something like this. And I think that's kind of what makes them interesting is like, yeah, it may not be as visually impressive and as immersive, but you can introduce a lot of interesting concepts and gameplay mechanics really quickly without having to expend so much effort.
This is what's freshest on my mind because this is what I've been playing in preparation for this podcast. And like you, Zach, I have not gotten to Beasts of Burden yet, which I'm sad I didn't because it sounds like it might be the one I will like the most. Um, but I just wanted to share two things that I took notes on from the first game, the Isle of Dragon Roar or whatever it's called. So the very first, you know how like for both monsters and characters, it's like once you've done sufficient number of interactions or you've done whatever you need to do, you get the reverse side of their card, which usually it's very similar to like weapon stories.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um with just a little bit of text and it reveals so much. And I think there's this theme around death and consumption and how we feel about that. The very first character I got was like just like generic woman. She's the one that has the bread and the knife. And when you get her card at first, the front side says, you know, she like works hard and cooks for her overbearing and abusive husband. And then
Didn't she kill him or
you
something?
get
Yeah.
the reverse side and it's like no one's seen her husband in a few days, but she's had meat on her table every day. And I'm like, all right, we're Sweeney Todding this. This is good. And then the other thing that stood out to me from the first game was that town Unionville. Do y'all remember this one?
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is the third or fourth town you go to, and it's as you're going, everyone's telling you, oh, it's this curious place where people and monsters get along. They live in peace and harmony together. And I'm just going to spoil this. It's more like they found a way to domesticate them, and but they're not just like chickens or cows because they can also talk. You learn this through the headman or mayor of the town inviting you to a meal, and then this girl's like, "Oh no, Mr. Flobby escaped," and you think like Mr. Flobby's like her best bud or a pet, and you go back and get him, and then he is dessert for the meal, and the girl doesn't seem to mind. Later, you talk to the girl, and she's like, "Oh, this is Mr. Globby, Mr. Flobby's cousin. Whatever." And you're just like, "Oh, it isn't just the mayor. Like this whole town, like these people suck." I don't know. Then there's bigger questions around, like, well, can I say that if I'm not a vegan? All of that, just like as like these are the things they're not afraid to get into, even for like this like simple looking lower budget card game. Like they're not afraid to go there. In every town you visit, there's dark things, there's things that make you think, make you feel not necessarily great about the world or yourself, and it causes you to question things.
Yeah, and I do think, Pat, like the low production value of the game kind of lends itself to that. It's like just enables them to explore those kind of ideas that might be more difficult in like a more conventional game, I guess, right? Because the potential audience can be much more narrow, right? Because there's just not as much invested in the game, and so it allows you to take those kind of narrative risks in a way that I don't
Mhm.
think they're able to always in the bigger productions.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that's exactly right.
And I think it's like a really clever way to get to the thing we've talked about the whole time, right? Which is perspective. I think that the weapon stories kind of did that, where like it would be like sort of would go and then like it would sort of twist, and it would go and then it would twist. And that's the way all his stories do to some degree. And I think that it's just like a really simple, clean way of getting to something that obviously he's interested in from all the way back to Drakengard, which I feel like we talked about 3 hours ago now, which is actually not far off. So one last question, and I think it's hard to answer with Yoko Taro, and that is like, where do you think he's going to go next? I know we know he's working on something. Is he working on an offline version of Reincarnation? Is he working on something totally different? What do you want him to work on next? What do you think he's going to? I can't imagine the next thing he's working on is not near. Just such a cash cow. If they just made something that is console based, and he calls himself a dirty capitalist all the time, and how much he talks about how much he dislikes making money. So, any thoughts on where Taro might go from here?
Based on Drakengard 3's character Accord and this sort of secret place referred to as the Kingdom of Night and everything that happened in near reincarnation, I would create a game and just call it like something something, and you put a 4 at the end. And instead of a Drakengard 4 or a near 4, it's both, because I think there's an opportunity for convergence of the series properly finally. And if he wanted to do it, he could. Um, Other than that, yeah, I think like a proper near 4, and I will call it near 4 because I do think near reincarnation is near 3. So, I mean, obviously, I also want near reincarnation to uh, exist offline, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was working on like a super mega big project and kind of just sort of keeping it under wraps for now. He, the near series had, near to near automata was 7 years. So if it takes 8 or 9 years or 10 years to get to the next thing, the next big thing, it wouldn't surprise me.
I mean, judging by what I know about near reincarnation, that would definitely make sense. But I wonder if if that was the direction they are going, if they almost like have to release a port of reincarnation just so people can like re-experience it. Like the interest is no doubt there. Like Nier Automata turned Nier into a blockbuster franchise essentially, but then this being a live service mobile game just made access such an issue that I think there's such a hunger for more people to experience Nier Incarnation, and it seems so important to give people that context if there's going to be, like you said, some sort of follow up that synthesizes the two franchises finally, which I think makes complete sense. We need that Nier Reincarnation first.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have no idea where he's gonna go. I guess I want I don't know. It would be nice to get more near, but I don't really care that much. If it's in the same universe, I'm not really interested in the lore. But I would like to see him maybe even kind of step out of the RPG space a little bit and do something that is a little more heavily just like some other genre. And I would like to see sort of what he could do with that personally.
Yeah, I agree, Zach. I kind of want him to just kind of make something completely new and interesting. And I mean, I think there will obviously inherently be connections to his other work. I mean, that's how he's worked, pretty much throughout his career. But um, I would hope for something like almost completely unexpected.
And if history is anything to go by, I'm guessing it will be one way or the other. Well, thank the three of you so much for coming along for this marathon conversation about Yoko Taro. There's a lot to talk about here. I feel like there were some games that we barely talked about, but we still have been here for close to 3 hours. So excellent job, you three, especially for keeping up with the energy on this. But let's talk about what's coming up next, where hopefully the podcast will not be as long as I let them go. So in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about Star Ocean 2. I'm guessing most of us will be playing the remake of that game that was, brought out on modern consoles recently. It's been a long time since I've played it. I'm actually not sure if I'll be revisiting it. Someone else might be hosting. I'm not sure yet. But one way or the other, for the next, 2 episodes, you're going to hear about Star Ocean 2, which I've heard great things about that remaster. After that, I actually don't know the order of things yet, but I have some sense of where things are going to go. I know we're going to have at least one episode on Final Fantasy Tactics. We're going to have some episodes on Dragon Quest 1 and 2. All those things are getting remakes / remasters very soon here. And then we're also going to have an episode that is more Western RPG focused on Obsidian, sort of looking at everything that Obsidian has done, their work. They've put out a lot of games recently. And so having a chat about Obsidian, I think it now is the time to do that. And I believe Aleks will be hosting that. So thanks, Aleks.
Yeah, happy to jump in for my first go.
Yeah. And if you want to get in touch with us, you want to email us whatever we missed about Yoko Taro, you can email me, retro@rpgfan.com. You can also find RPG Fan on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, X, Blue Sky, Twitch, YouTube. We have a Discord called RPG Fan. We also, we can be found pretty much anywhere as RPG Fan or RPG Fan.com. We also have 2 shops if you want to support us. One is hosted by TeePublic, where they sell things like t-shirts, mugs, things like that. The other is Hyperplay RPG, where we host our review card collection, which is a collection of 300 review cards that you might have seen on Instagram. It's very cool, very high quality book. We also have 2 other fine podcasts. One is Random Encounter, which is hosted every 2 weeks by Jono, where they talk usually about new events, new games, sometimes new books, which is what I believe they've done most recently. And then we also have Rhythm Encounter, usually hosted by Mike Salbato, about RPG music. And those are both really, really cool to check out. If you want to review us, you can review us on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify. We love feedback, especially of the 5-star variety. And let's talk about how we can get in touch with the individual panelists, starting with you, Aleks.
You can just email me at alexfraniczek@gmail.com.
And Ben.
You can email me at benloganlove@gmail.com.
And then Pat.
I use my RPG Fan email address, so that's the letter P and then Gann, Gann, @rpgfan.com.
Perfect. And if you want to get in touch with me, email is also good, zachw@rpgfan.com. I'm also on our Discord as ZachW. And again, thank the 3 of you so much for coming along, having this very lengthy chat about Yoko Taro and all the different things that he deals with and all the different things that he talks about. And thank you, listeners. Good night and good luck.